Coming up, we're going to ask whether Democrats should seriously consider spending big money in what were once considered second-tier presidential battlegrounds like Iowa and Ohio. Some party leaders are urging the Biden campaign and allies to do just that. But so far, many groups say they are focused on just the 6 core battleground states. But first, I think we can say that no incumbent president seeking re-election has ever had as politically disastrous a spring as Donald Trump just did, at least not in modern American history. The latest confirmation, a new national survey from the New York Times that shows Trump trailing Joe Biden by an astounding 14-point margin, 50% to 36%. Perhaps even more daunting for the president. His polls in battleground states aren't any better. In Wisconsin, perhaps the one swing state to rule them all, 3 recent surveys, 3 of them, have shown Biden's lead near or exceeding 10 points. It's the kind of position for Trump that few analysts scarcely imagined would have been possible when the year began. So I wanted to bring on our White House team this week because I'm going to ask them to lay out how exactly Trump could conceivably climb out of this hole. I know it's a question a lot of Republicans and Democrats alike are asking themselves right now, and no doubt it is a big task. So Francesca, you're up first. What needs to start going right for Trump?
Well, first of all, the COVID spikes that we've seen in states where the president had planned to have rallies like North Carolina and Florida. So in speaking to the Trump campaign this week, they've continued to say that he will have rallies. That is going to continue to happen. But notice, Alex, how no rallies have been put on the schedule again since that Tulsa rally that took place over the weekend, in which almost 10, I think it was 8 Trump campaign staffers who were there in Tulsa tested positive for COVID. So if you're looking at that and you want to be able to have rallies, but the battleground states all have spiking cases of COVID, that's a problem. So that's how those two things are related for Donald Trump. But the way that he has chosen to handle this, for anyone who watched Saturday night's rally in Tulsa, which, by the way, Alex, I know that you were watching, and I'm so sorry. I was texting you repeatedly during it. So excited about this week's podcast and what we could possibly discuss.
Well, clearly I was having a wild and crazy Saturday night.
Wild and crazy Saturday night during the pandemic. We were texting each other about a Trump rally. The way that Donald Trump has chosen to address this, though, is to clearly drill down into what he sees as his base, which applies to a lot of different states, particularly these swing states, Wisconsin, that we were talking about, and how he thinks that he can win them. And just on the face of it, if you pay attention to the message that he had that night, he talked a lot about our heritage. He talked about protesters who are pulling down statues or trying to pull down those statues. He said that some of those protesters might not even be Americans. Now, one you could look at and say that's a one-off. But then he also called it the Kung flu. And that is something that was repeated at his event in Arizona. So he is clearly appealing to a very specific kind of supporter that he hopes to turn out in this election. Some really good pieces on this week. I actually want to call one by one of our competitors, but it was very good. David Nakamura of the Washington Post, who did something on this about what it is that Trump is actually trying to do here. But he talked about Asian Americans and the terms that Donald Trump is using in these rallies. It would be very difficult to argue, at least at this point, that when that's the basis of everything that he's saying at these events, that he is not specifically targeting white working class voters in this election versus some of the other voters that we've been talking about in multiple editions of this episode. And race is a tough issue to discuss, but that is the language that he is using.
Right. He uses sort of a racist provocation to try as a wedge issue to try to drive up some interest in his base. Look, and I'm sure you share the skepticism. I'm skeptical of whether or not that can really broaden his support, because the problem right now is, look, of course, Trump is going to hold on to his core base until the end of time. But his problem right now is some of the softer Donald Trump supporters, people maybe who voted for him because they really didn't like Hillary Clinton in 2016. We've seen them really, their support for Trump drop dramatically the last few months. Let's though, before we move on, Francesca, let's stay on the rally, because it was billed as basically the de facto start of his reelection campaign. It was hyped endlessly by both Trump himself and his campaign manager, Brad Pascal, talking about how there were 1 million people who were going to turn out. And the major takeaways from that rally were that the attendance, according to local officials, was just a hair over 6,000, that he spent about 15 minutes defending the way he walked down a ramp at West Point and drank water, and that he slowed down testing, which was a clip that is now playing endlessly on a lot of Democratic ads. What was the sense within the White House and other Republicans about what went wrong and just how bad was the fallout from that?
Sure. And I just want to follow up on something else you said before about expanding the base, though. But that does not appear to be what he is trying to do at this point. Right. If there was ever an argument that he needed to expand it or was trying to by reaching out to minority voters, right, that was a retreat from that positioning in what we have heard in the last two major events that he has had, and he is digging in to the base. And it appears to be at this point that the way that he thinks that he can come back from where he is against Joe Biden is by turning out more of his base. And so that is why he's focusing on getting those people excited about this election versus what we had heard before, at least in the weeks before that, where he was super excited about maybe doing a policing bill, and thought something should happen there. Yesterday, we heard him say that may not even happen at this point. And he wasn't pushing for it. He wasn't like, I'm calling on Congress right now to get this done. He had an opportunity to do that. He didn't. So I do think that tells you a lot about what the campaign strategy, what his strategy is moving forward here. As far as the Tulsa rally goes, the campaign.
A lot for words. That's like a lot of people think.
The campaign has pushed all week this message that that's not that big of a deal. There were 12,000 people there. That's more than the fire marshal said, because the fire marshal said that there were 6,000. 12,000 is not much better than 6,000 when there were close to a million people who signed up. They have said that their data isn't corrupted because they use a lot of this, to gather data for who their supporters are. They've really, they've been writing this off at this point as the media scared away their supporters, which I've seen some good responses to this too, which is if the people who are saying those things are on CNN and MSNBC, there's a strong question as to whether or not Trump supporters are watching those networks. And if they are, whether or not those are the people they'd be listening to over Donald Trump himself and why. And that perhaps that really also tells you something about his problem is that given the opportunity, whether you should trust the campaign about how it's safe to come out during COVID or the news media in this particular instance, even the Trump campaign's argument would suggest that they trusted the news media more.
So Michael, Francesca astutely makes the point that Trump very clearly, his response to these slipping poll numbers is to try to get his hardcore base to circle the wagons and to drive out turnout among those voters. What else do you see the president trying to do, or what else does he need to start doing or count on happening, and even beyond his control in your view?
Yeah, and to that point, I think one of the fundamental questions of this election is going to be when you have a matchup between a candidate that induces great passions on both sides of the aisle, positive and negative, right, in Trump, and you have in the competing candidate one who doesn't really excite either his base or his opposition, which is better off, right? That is not what we had in 2016. We had two candidates that were very polarizing. And in the theme of silver linings for Trump, one of the few consistent positives in recent polling has been that people aren't really feeling the need to ride with Biden, right? And enthusiasm matters because enthusiasm is turnout. And one of the most enthusiastic voter groups for Biden is Black voters. And it's going to be really interesting to see whether they come out for him more so than they did for Hillary Clinton, whose husband famously was called the first Black president and who also worked in the Obama administration and also had Obama campaigning for her. But there are a lot of things that the president can do to turn this around if we're, painting it in the rosiest way possible. And I think the campaign's ideal scenario is it doesn't require the president to do much, right? Because the closer we get to the actual election, the more pressure on Biden there's going to be for him to do more than whatever it is he's doing now, right? Obviously, the less media attention he gets, the less questioning he receives, the fewer appearances, the more of an open canvas he becomes for voters who essentially want any kind of alternative to Trump. And you inevitably see a tightening of any major race, any general election race. But there's a possibility that this tightening will be especially pronounced the more attention is paid to Biden as we progress through the race, really regardless of what either of them does. So I do think that there's an assumption that tightening is going to occur. Secondly, the president has two very basic things that he needs to do. He needs to turn out his base, as Francesca has highlighted, and he needs to suppress Biden's as much as possible. And the two crises that we're experiencing right now with the pandemic and in race relations do provide the president with some potential tools to achieve both of those things. And what's clear from the data that I've seen, you obviously mentioned the New York Times poll, and there was a CNBC poll this morning that was really interesting, is that Trump needs to win back white voters across the spectrum. And what you've seen is that his handling of these two crises has harmed him both with young white voters and surprisingly with old white voters. So his aides surely are looking at these numbers and thinking he has very little to lose in adjusting his message to win back those who think that it's gotten too extreme. Francesca and I are obviously keenly interested in whether or not that is the direction he'll go. And the question is whether the damage that's been done already is irreparable. But I'm of the opinion that very little is irreparable in politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty clearly, the question moving forward is how much of this race has changed structurally, and that there are just a wide group of voters who have decided that barring something truly dramatic, they're not going to vote for Donald Trump, and how much of this is just temporary. And then you could even see that it skews the polls in a way. It's called response bias. Republicans clearly seeing that things aren't going well are less likely to pick up the phone or answer a pollster's questions, and that shows an inflated lead for Joe Biden. I'm inclined to think that right now, and I know most of the Democrats and even most of the Republicans I talk to think certainly to some degree this race has changed structurally, and that some of the changes are going to be more permanent.